no idea where my money was going, how much money I was spending, and what my stable fixed expenses looked like every month. And then finally, when my advisor offered the fellowship, and she's like, hey, you should go on this fellowship. I was like, oh, I don't know. I can't do student loans. I have to look into it. So maybe I can afford it, but I'm not sure. So this is where the scientist mindset came in. It's like, okay, I need objective data to look at my situation and make an informed decision.
Welcome to the Personal Finance for PhDs podcast, a higher education in personal finance. This podcast is for PhDs and PhDs-to-be who want to explore the hidden curriculum of finances to learn the best practices for money management, career advancement, and advocacy for yourself and others. I'm your host, Dr. Emily Roberts, a financial educator specializing in early career PhDs and founder of Personal Finance for PhDs. This is Season 17, Episode 8, and today my guest is Fern Wolburg Martinez, a fourth-year PhD student in Industrial Organizational Psychology at Portland State. Fern shares the pros and cons of the various income sources she's used for her graduate work: a teaching assistantship, a fellowship, student loans, side jobs, and social safety net programs. When Fern was offered a fellowship, she realized she would no longer be eligible to take out student loans and had to decline it. Fern subsequently worked on her spending and budgeting to put herself in a position to accept the fellowship and increase her income later on. Finally, Fern and I discuss how you can employ a researcher's skills and mindset in the personal finance arena. If you're listening to this episode on the day it drops, you know that it is tax day. I hope that you have already submitted your 2023 tax return, paid your 2023 tax bill, and made your 2024 Q1 estimated tax payment on your fellowship, if required. However, there have been many years in which I was still working on any or all of those elements right up to and even past the deadline. If you're in that position and need additional resources on taxes tailored to the graduate student postdoc or postbac experience, join one of my asynchronous tax workshops to immediately access my best teaching on these topics. Go to pfforphds.com/tax and scroll to the bottom of the page to learn more about the tax return preparation workshop and the estimated tax workshop. Best of luck to you in these final hours of tax season. You can find the show notes for this episode at pfforphds.com/S17E8. Without further ado, here's my interview with Fern Wolburg Martinez. Delighted to have joining me on the podcast today, Fern Wolburg Martinez. She is a current graduate student at Portland State in Industrial Organizational Psychology, and we are going to talk about how Fern has funded her graduate program, both through the graduate program, through side hustles. We're also going to talk about budgeting and just really get into the numbers today of what a current graduate student is making and spending. So Fern, I'm so delighted to have you on. Thank you so much for volunteering to come on and be open about this subject. And would you please introduce yourself a little bit further for the listeners?
Yeah, thank you, Emily. So, like you mentioned, I'm Fernanda. I go by Fern, and I am currently in my fourth year of my graduate program, preparing for my comprehensive exams, and my expertise is on occupational health psychology. Specifically, I explore how sexual harassment and customer sexual harassment affects the well-being of employees.
Okay, thank you so much. Can you tell us about how your program has been funded to date?
Yeah, so the nice thing about my program is just a master's to PhD program, and it's fully funded if you get accepted. So they cover tuition, everything, and it was an interesting trajectory because we had a stipend that was very low. It was after taxes, it was about $1,000 a month, and then the students really advocated for more because that barely covers rent in Portland. Portland's a pretty expensive city. And then they raised the stipend by almost 200%. So after taxes, it ended up being $2,000. And that's just for the graduate teaching assistantships. And we also have an amazing funding program from the National Institute of Health, which is under the CDC. which is an OHP or occupational health psychology type of training where they give a fellowship to up to 3 to 4 students per year, and you can have it for 2 years. And that's what I'm currently on. And that one is not taxed, and it's about like $2,400 a month.
Okay, I want to hear more about this advocacy process. It doesn't sound like, was there an official union going on, or was it just like, nope, we're all just talking together and saying, you have to pay us more, this is unsustainable?
Yeah, so I cannot take full credit for that, not even partial credit, because I have to say it's when I started the program, it's kind of like, oh, I'm so excited to have a PhD and join this program, and I don't care how much money it is. And then I face the realities of actually having to live on that stipend and take out student loans and the stress that comes with that, because grad student loans are different from undergrad student loans with the interest and the plus loans. So I was just dealing with it, and I was like, this is fine. This is the way it is. And stressfully, but thankfully I started during COVID, so I was still living at home in Arizona at this time, so I could still save on rent, but it was still nothing, right? And it's not until the cohort after me that the program really focused on diversifying our population of students. And these students from different backgrounds were all about fighting for themselves and for the collective well-being. And they were like, this is not a livable stipend. And if you want to be a diverse and competitive program, you need to do something about it. So they really insisted with the faculty. And we do have a union, but the union, the students can barely afford to pay for the rent. So like, never mind paying for a union due, right? So they didn't go through the union. It was more like the psychology department students from that specific cohort just really advocated with the faculty. And then the faculty were also really amazing at being receptive about it and talking to the dean about it. And I'm not sure how they moved the funds around, but they were able to increase the stipend for everybody.
Wow. Love to hear that success story, especially.
Yeah, shout out to them.
I mean, the union approach is certainly powerful, but it's slow and it's onerous. And so this sounds like kind of a quicker, if the faculty and so forth, everybody is amenable to it, this is kind of like a quicker route. So I'm so glad to hear that story of how that cohort after you helped themselves and everybody else by just talking about this. And $1,000 a month is just ridiculous for an amount of stipend to try to live on that. Okay, so it sounds like you had been on a teaching assistantship at first. Is that right? For at least a couple years?
Yes, for the first 3 years.
Okay, so for 3 years on a teaching assistantship, now you're on this fellowship through the federal funding kind of route. Can you tell us, in terms of your experience as a graduate student, what the advantages, or the pros and cons were for each of these different types of funding?
Yeah, so the teaching assistantship, it's like a regular W-2 job. So your taxes are taken out. You don't have to worry about that. You get the same money at the same time every month. It's less money though. So it's about, oh my God, what's the difference? Like $500 less, probably more in comparison to the fellowship. But the biggest pro about that, besides the fact that they give you the W-2 and the taxes, is that you can take out student loans with that. So with having the teaching assistantship, I was also able to qualify for loans. And then like my teaching assistantship would pay for rent and some credit card bills or whatever else I had to pay. And then I would use the student loans to pay for like, if I wanted to visit my family, if I have to travel to conferences, if I have to buy food, if I want to go eat out with my friends. So everything else was covered by the loans. And then the pro of the fellowship is the time flexibility, because I'm just doing research. I don't have to do a teaching assistantship. And sometimes just working with professors and instructors can be a great experience, and sometimes not such a great experience, and you never know who you're going to get and if it's going to be a more stressful term in comparison to the previous one. So having the time flexibility to do research on my own time and work on my own projects and get paid for that is amazing. It's also more money, but the cons is it's weirdly coded, this grant. I think there's only like 3 universities in the United States that have this type of fellowship, and it's coded so that it counts the tuition reimbursement as part of the fellowship that we receive. So it counts as salary. So we no longer qualify for loans because we're making too much money. So beyond our monthly stipend, that tuition money also looked like from the tax perspective, from the government's perspective, that money goes to us instead of it going to the university for tuition. So I no longer qualify for student loans at the moment. So that's why I waited my 3 years until I was at a place where I had I could afford rent and I had paid off all my debt so that I could actually take out this fellowship and not have to rely on student loans, which was always my goal, to only take out loans for 2 to 3 years and then not for the last 2 years of my program.
I see. So it sounds like you actually had a degree of agency over when you had one position versus another. So you could kind of coordinate that with your personal finances. I haven't heard of that before. I guess I'm more accustomed to people like sort of being the timing of fellowships happening just based on like your timing in your program or something like that, or like when you happen to win it. But that sounds really, really smart that you worked on your personal finances while you had access to those loans before switching over. I'm a little surprised to hear that you don't have access to loans anymore, but I don't know. Yeah. I don't know all the details about it. So I'm sure you've been through the technical specifications.
Yeah, it was a whole thing because I actually got it offered my second year and I said, yeah, I'll take it. And then I found out they didn't let me know. It was miscommunication. I found out that I couldn't qualify for loans anymore and I had to tell my advisor like, hey, I didn't know about this and I can no longer afford anything if I can't take out loans. So they had to switch me back to being a TA-ship. So after that, I was like, okay, next time if I do switch back to a fellowship, I want to be more conscious and in a good place where I can actually take advantage of that.
Yeah, I think the generalizable, lesson here for the audience is just to be really heavily consider how these different types of funding are going to affect your personal finances, whether it's, the tax implications, whether it's the student loan implications, whether it's the increasing amount of take-home income, decreasing amount of take-home income, and just as best you're able to, like you did, exert, agency in this process and or prepare on the personal finance side for the changes that are upcoming so that you're not caught. I mean, what would you have done? Like if you had to accept this fellowship, couldn't afford everything, couldn't take out student loans. Well, we're going to talk more about how you've made the budget balance in a moment. But yeah, it would have been a harder financial position for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's very important for people who are in grad school and are considering one versus the other to look into, like you said, taxes, student loans, and just asking all the questions to their advisor regarding these things. I think that supervisor support is very important. If you have a supervisor who's transparent about the process and helping you to the best of their capabilities on everything that entails going into a fellowship versus having a regular teaching assistantship with all that stuff.
Yeah. Did you also have a side job at any point during these 4 years?
Yeah, I worked my first 2 years and, I was in college, I had 2 jobs and I was going to the gym at 5 a.m. and it's but I was also 18, 20 years old. It's very different than going to grad school. Grad school is a different beast. So I had a job for the first 2 years. I was working in the restaurant industry, which is what inspired my thesis topic. And it was really stressful because, I don't know if you remember what your first 2 years were like, but it would take me 4 hours to read a 20-page article because the content is so dense and so difficult and so different from just a textbook. So I was spending my time with the 4 hours classes per week and 2 classes for every week. And then also on top of that, reading the articles. And then in the weekends I was working. So I was just exhausted all the time. I was burnt out. It wasn't great for my health. So I decided on my second year to quit. And then on my third year again, before I moved to Portland, I decided to get a job to be able to afford to move to Portland. So I started working back in the restaurant industry. So I have a lot of respect for restaurant employees because that industry is always there when we need it. But it's definitely a sacrifice. The quality of my work and the quality of my health did decline, but it's also a trade-off of then I can have more money that I don't have to give back to the government.
Yeah, I mean, because you had the stipend, you had the student loan kind of bridge coming in, and you had the side work, you really had to find that balance among all 3 of those things and which funding source is most appropriate and how much energy would you have to use and so forth. So that's really tricky. And since you've switched over to the fellowship, it sounds like you haven't been working on the side, right, with the higher income?
No, I did hold so this was another opportunity that just came to me and fell on my lap. This student recently graduated and her and I just had a really good working relationship and worked in a lot of projects together. So she really liked my work ethic. So she recommended me to do a summer internship that she had to turn down, and that worked great for me. So I was doing analysis for the university, factor analyses, where they wanted to reduce the items on a course evaluation scale. And that was awesome because I was able to make a couple extra, like 2,000 that month or that summer. So opportunities like that arise as I progress through the program and I become more skilled. Like now I'm at the point that with my master's, I can get an internship, and that's a lot more money than any part-time job can give me, right? So opportunities come and go. And also it's just every year is different, and just have to adapt and find ways to make the finances work.
Yeah, I like that you pointed that out. Like as you progress in your program, you become more skilled, you become more knowledgeable. There are different opportunities that come up for you. I'm like, you've probably heard me say on the podcast before, but I'm like a big advocate of people being paid a high hourly rate as much as they can. And that probably means employing your unique skills that you're developing inside of academia, maybe outside of academia. So in addition to the stipend from the assistantship and the fellowship, in addition to the student loans for some of the time, in addition to the side work, I understand that you also relied on government programs for a period of time. Can you tell us more about the types of programs that you accessed and what they did for you?
Yes. So I need to give credit again to the cohort that came after me, because I was like, oh, I'm just stuck in this. And some people mentioned food stamps, but I went into the SNAP, and SNAP is, I don't know what it stands for, but it's the Food Stamps Assistance Program. And they said that graduate students didn't qualify, and I didn't look further into it. I was like, okay, I just don't qualify. Undergrads do, but graduates don't for whatever reason. And then the cohort after me said, yeah, you do qualify. I'm on it. And I had never been on food stamps before. And I also had this perception that food stamps was for people that were very low income and really needed it and were like below the poverty level. And I'm a grad student, so I can still rely on my parents if I need to. So I just didn't see myself in that realm. But if anything, once they told me that they were on it and I could apply for it, and I applied and I got it, and I got an extra $200 a month to be able to pay for groceries, it was great. And it just gave me a lot of independence and freedom and just a lot of relief for my expenses, because sometimes if I have to pay for conferences and I have to pay my bills and everything else, then I would just buy less food. And with the food stamps, it's like, oh, now I can afford it. And also relying on the food pantry at my university. And a lot of us got on food stamps. And what's also great about this program is that, at least in Portland, they're very supportive of the arts. So if you show your EBT card, which is how you pay for the food stamps, I thought it was actual stamps. It's not actual stamps. It's like they give you like a little debit card and they refill it every month with X amount of dollars that they give you every month. And like it never expires until you no longer qualify for the program. But if you show your EBT card, then you can also get $5 entries to like museums and opera concerts and ballet concerts. So it's great also for that experience. If you also can't afford hobbies and to get out there and have fun things to do, it also brings that option on the table.
So I want to follow up on two pieces to that. For the first is the mindset. This is not for people like me. But you mentioned you're making $1,000 a month. That's not a lot of money in an expensive city, as you mentioned. So like, I'm glad that you brought up like the fluctuating expenses too, because you might think in a given month, I don't have any problems paying for food this month, so I don't need this program. But then the next month you have an unexpected expense that comes up. And like you said, the food is like the variable thing that can get sacrificed that month. And it's just not a position that you want to be in. It's better to be precautionary, take all the benefits that you're eligible for, use them to the fullest extent, and then have more reserves to be able to build up for those unexpected expenses that might come up. So I'm really glad that you mentioned this and that you did take advantage. I want to learn more about, okay, you initially read grad students weren't eligible, then you found out that you were. Well, what changed? What was the difference?
I don't know. I didn't ask. I just applied. I told them how much I made, and they said yes. I don't know if it's one of those things where it's like, we're going to look the other way. It's just graduate students are in this unique position where we're students, but we're employees, and the taxes are different. And like, I'm not poor, but I'm below the poverty line, but I have an iPhone. So it's really weird mindset and like thing to get into. And also there's like, I don't want to take resources from the people that really need it, but also I qualify for these resources. So it's this like weird situation that I had to just get over and be like, just apply. If they say no, no. Which eventually they did say no once I got my fellowship, and I make too much money for them. But yeah, I think it's important that if there's resources out there, if it's food stamps and this and that, I was like, oh my God, I can't believe I'm going to be on food stamps. And I was like, no, this is great. I love them. I can go to $5 Chinese gardens and explore. It's something that otherwise I wouldn't be able to afford because it's too expensive. And I can afford food, which is great. And I don't have to stress out about buying that. And it's nice because it's an allocated amount of money that's specific for groceries. I cannot go and spend it on anything else. So yeah, I don't know what was different in the application process. The website says that I shouldn't have qualified, but I did qualify, so worked out for me.
I like that approach of just like make them tell you no. Just apply, just push. If they say no, okay, you aren't any worse off than you were beforehand. But hey, they said yes. And like, again, credit to that cohort behind you for like experimenting with this and just pushing for it and helping everybody by, you know, sharing what they found out.
Yeah, definitely. They helped change my mindset, and they're helping change the program for the better.
I love it. Okay, so were there any other public benefits that you've been taking advantage of?
Yeah, I can't remember the difference between Medicare and Medicaid, but I'm on that. And that's for health insurance. Portland State University has mandatory health insurance. So this is crazy. One thing that I don't like about my university is that if you don't have health insurance, they automatically enroll you in the university's health insurance, which is very expensive. It's like $300 a month. And that's a little ridiculous to me because if you can't afford to have health insurance, then they get you on their expensive health insurance. And yeah, it's weird. I appreciate the aspect of wanting to keep the overall community healthy, but at the same time as employees wouldn't qualify for health insurance from the university, whereas other universities do. So I decided to apply for the Obamacare, and again, I qualified for that, and I have it. And it's in Oregon. It's actually great. It's completely free for me, and I have a really great doctors and a really good network of doctors. I was able to go to the dentist after like 5 years of not being able to afford it. So another great benefit to use.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's so common. All universities require that their students have health insurance. It's unfortunate. It sounds like their internal option is unaffordable, like you said, for the students. But it's so great. Obviously, this is a very state-by-state thing, but great that Oregon has a robust exchange. And with your income and everything, you were able to qualify at that. It sounds like zero premium, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that's amazing. Yeah. Another great thing to look into.
Yeah, and it's like above a percentage of the poverty level. So you can be, I think, 200% above the poverty level and still qualify in Oregon, but it varies by state.
Emily here for a brief interlude. Tax season is in full swing, and the best place to go for information tailored to you as a graduate student, postdoc, or postbac is pfforphds.com/tax. From that page, I have linked to all of my free tax resources, many of which I have updated for this tax year. On that page, you will find podcast episodes, videos, and articles on all kinds of tax topics relevant to PhDs and PhDs to be. There are also opportunities to join the Personal Finance for PhDs mailing list to receive PDF summaries and spreadsheets that you can work with. Again, you can find all of these free resources linked from pfforphds.com/tax. Now back to the interview. Now, you mentioned to me that the way you budget has changed throughout graduate school. We've already seen some hints of that in the changing of the funding and the different, sources of income and so forth. But can you tell us about how you used to budget and then how you budget now?
Yeah, so the simple storyline is that I didn't budget. I would just have my money and spend it and not know where it went. And I would get my student loans, and I would put half of them, because I get them per term, so every 3 months. So I would put half of them on my savings account. That was not a high yield savings account, so they was just sitting there doing nothing. And then I would just keep the rest in my checking account and just hope that the number didn't get to zero. So I would try to keep it as high as possible. But no idea where my money was going, how much money I was spending, and what my stable fixed expenses looked like every month. And then finally, what my advisor offered the fellowship, and she's like, hey, you should go on this fellowship. I was like, I don't know, I can't do student loans. I have to look into it. And at the time I had moved in with my partner, and I was like, well, my rent is about to be cheaper. I'm on food stamps, so my groceries about to be cheaper. So maybe I can afford it, but I'm not sure. So this is where the scientist mindset came in. Is like, okay, I need objective data to look at my situation and make an informed decision. So that's when I had a breakdown. What I first did is track my expenses for a month, and that's when I realized, like, oh, I go to the groceries, like I buy little snacks here and there way too much, and I'm spending too much at the bars. And why am I buying shoes that I can't afford? And that was like a wake up call for me. So then I decided to look at my fixed expenses and see what that looks like, and see if I had any money left over for me to have a decent living, because again, I couldn't take out student loans and I didn't want to take on an extra job to protect my well-being and my mental health. So if my remaining balance after all my fixed expenses was something like 100, that's just not realistic. That's just not enough, especially right now with inflation. Everything's very expensive. So if there was an emergency, anything, I wouldn't have been able to do it. So it's like, okay, first thing I need to do is set up my emergency savings. And then I started learning about finances, and I was like, okay, I need a high yield savings account so that the money that I have extra is not just sitting there, it's actually like accumulating interest. And I started doing that, and now I know exactly how much I spend on what each month. I know how much I have left over each month, and it's a really good feeling.
I'm so glad to hear about that positive kind of transformation. It sounds like your income source is changing is what really prompted you. You knew you weren't going to have that cushion of the student loan. So like you had to get more granular about what was going on in your finances.
I've always been pretty good at not spending and saving, but now I want to take it to the next step and make my money work for me. So investing in a retirement account and knowing what I'm spending on and being more essential with like my buckets of money of like skincare makes me really happy. So I want to spend more on that, and I don't want to eat out as much. So I'm cooking a lot more now. So I want to be a lot smarter with my money beyond just saving and not spending.
Now, you mentioned earlier kind of taking the researcher's approach, actually looking at the data to figure out where your spending was going and what you really started budgeting. Like, what were you going to be able to afford? Were you going to be able to afford to switch onto this fellowship, given the new rent, given all the other changes that were going on? Are there any other ways that you've employed this like researcher mindset within your personal finances aside from setting up the budget?
I mean, beyond finding you in your account, because my friend Morgan always says this to me every time I'm like, oh, I need to do something really hard. And she's like, you're getting a PhD. You can do anything. It's like, you're right. Like, I know how to investigate. I know how to learn. I need to start doing that. So I remember I wanted to get more broad skill sets with data analysis. And I was like, well, Excel is always required. So I'm going to learn how to use Excel. So I'm going to use a nice spreadsheet as an excuse to learn Excel. And my excuse to do that is going to be by budgeting. So now I have this like really fancy spreadsheet that has formulas that are connected through different tabs and different cells. And I really learned how to use Excel for my advantage and use data visualization to look like my most expense categories. And I have different percentages for everything. And and with that is just learning how to use Excel. So looking at tutorials and then actually doing the work, which is a lot of what we have to do as PhDs when our advisors don't know how to use something in SPSS and no one else knows how to do it. And you just have to learn how to use an SPSS macro yourself. And then learning the lingo. So like, okay, if I want to go beyond saving and start investing, what does that look like? And what does that mean? And where does it start? So looking at the experts, kind of like when you're doing a lit review, and you just have no idea what the topic is about. So you have to read a bunch of articles until you get an understanding of what that topic is. The same skill sets can be applied to budgeting and knowing where your money goes, and then just implementing that behavioral change whenever we write our research articles. And at least in psychology, we always try to make practical recommendations of what organizations can do with the research findings that we have. It's like, okay, how can we expect other people to follow these behaviors that we're suggesting to do if we can't follow the own behaviors that we are learning from budgeting and all these other behavioral things? Because also saving money and spending money is very psychological, right? So just the same skills that we learn on research can be applied to anything, in particular right now talking about budgeting.
I love it. I love the way you articulated that and that mindset, and kind of going back to the beginning of what you said, like what your friend Morgan has been telling you. I totally agree. And I never like felt so accomplished or like expansive in my person as I did like right after I defended. Like I literally felt like I was like on top of a mountain. Like I finished my dissertation. I defended it. It's done. I literally can do anything I put my mind to. And even though personal finances are challenging in psychological ways and logistical ways and all of that, like you said, when you take everyone who gets into a PhD program is so capable and so talented and so smart. And like, if you just decide to apply what you kind of already innately can do in these other areas of your life to your personal finances, like you're going to be successful. It's just a matter of time. Yeah. It's a matter of time and a matter of increasing that income eventually when you get out of graduate school. So
eventually,
I just love that approach. Okay, well, Fern, would you like to wrap up now by telling us your best financial advice for another early career PhD? And it could be something that we've touched on already in the interview, or it could be something completely new.
Advice. Oh my God. I don't know if I have any advice. I just feel like advice is so like personal and individualized, but I have like a thought that just occurred to me with what you were saying, is that a lot of new PhDs have this huge, especially underrepresented PhDs, women of color, or people from like low socioeconomic backgrounds whose parents never went to college, or immigrants. There's this huge imposter syndrome that we start with. There's like, oh, I'm not supposed to be here. And now looking back, I think if like the first year Fern met with the Fern right now, fourth year Fern, she would be like, oh my God, that girl is so smart and I'll just never be like her. And like, that is me. So I think it's really important to understand that imposter syndrome is just your social comparison of where you think you need to get and where you are. And it's all about learning. The only way to get over that imposter syndrome is to actually do and increase our self-efficacy and our belief that we can do these things. So just that can apply to anything, right? With budgeting, is like, it's not this imposter syndrome of like, I have to have X amount of money in order to be successful. It's like, you just have to learn how to budget and learn those skills and just do it. And then once you feel confident about it, that imposter syndrome will just eventually dissipate, and just pass on that knowledge to people who are just getting started.
And that ties in back so well with what we were talking about with like the social programs that you learned about from like your peers and everything. Just not counting yourself out as like, oh, I'm not the type of person who should be doing this at this stage. Yes, you are. These programs are designed for you at this current stage. You're not going to use them forever. It's going to be a temporary thing, but it's really going to help you get your feet under you, and you only needed to be on them for, 2-3 years. And now you have this fantastic fellowship, and like things are so different in your finances now, just after the passage of a little bit of time and a little bit of change of income sources. So again, I'm so glad that you share these tips and these insights with the audience. Thank you so much for volunteering to come on and being so transparent. And I really think people got a ton out of this interview. So thank you.
I hope so. Yeah. Thank you so much for having me.
Listeners, thank you for joining me for this episode. I have a gift for you. You know that final question I ask of all my guests regarding their best financial advice? I have collected short summaries of all the answers ever given on the podcast into a document that is updated with each new episode release. You can gain access to it by registering for my mailing list at pfforphds.com/advice. Would you like to access transcripts or videos of each episode? I link the show notes for each episode from pfforphds.com/podcast. See you in the next episode, and remember, you don't have to have a PhD to succeed with personal finance, but it helps. Nothing you hear on this podcast should be taken as financial, tax, or legal advice for any individual. The music is Stages of Awakening by Poddington Bear from the Free Music Archive and is shared under CC by NC. Podcast editing by Dr. Lourdes Bobbio and show notes creation by Dr. Jill Hoffman.